Hey everyone watching on YouTube, this is Jaylen Bledsoe, and this is my podcast. It's my YouTube channel, and it might honestly just be a mechanism to create TikToks, create Reels, so forth and so on. I've had a podcast for some time in audio. I've had a YouTube channel as well for a while. I've had a nice subscriber base, but ultimately I neglected that audience because I did not post. I would go on there probably once a year and make like my annual video, and that was about it. So what I'm trying to do now is, start fresh. I actually deleted my YouTube channel not too long ago, and I had a nice number of subscribers there, but because I neglected it, I realized, I thought about it, if I'm going to go live again at some point, if I'm going to create content at some point, let's just start fresh with an audience that knows me for that conversation versus a few viral videos or interviews from 10 years ago. So I'm excited to be with you all today. I've gotten a lot of requests on my Instagram and Facebook asking me to break down big business or economic news. And ultimately, I did an Instagram live last week and ended with Q&A. And much of that conversation was on personal finance. So I'm going to dazzle a little bit of that into the dialogue. Of course, today is Memorial Day, a day we honor and remember the men and women who died while serving in the U.S. military. So I just want to say thank you to the servicemen and servicewomen and their families for the sacrifice and service you've made for our country. I also hope that those of you who are watching have enjoyed this holiday weekend with your friends and your family. I got some good time today with my mother, my great aunt, some of my little siblings, and today's also my brother's birthday. So Austin, if you're watching this, you're probably not. Happy birthday. I remember the moment my parents told me I was going to be an older sibling again. I think that was maybe 8 or 9 times over at that point with a 16-year gap with 2 siblings 2 weeks apart. That's a story for another day. But today we're going to talk about the debt ceiling crisis, the recession, Fed interest rate hikes, and a successful opening weekend of The Little Mermaid with Halle Bailey and Melissa McCarthy. And something fun, there was this new release with Photoshop, their new generative AI tool, which is honestly really amazing. I had some time to play around with it, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, when it comes to numbers, Little Mermaid this weekend was a success, bringing in $116.8 million in the U.S. in the box office, and total with international $185.8 million. That makes this the 5th largest opening for Memorial Day weekend in the history of releases. Now, Disney's live-action remake of its 1989 animated classic, received, for the most part, celebration. Black women, black communities, minority communities loved what happened with this release, but there's also a number of people who are not upset about it. I mean, you go back to the protest of the hashtag #NotMyAriel, and just people who are miffed by the idea of a black Disney princess who's also a mermaid. Because, apparently we all thought that mermaids were of one color, and it's now an issue. I think it's even crazier to that point. IMDb had to clean up reviews over the weekend due to the review bombing, dragging the scores down. Like, that's just unbelievable to think about. But hey, it is America, and that's what happens in today's age. Everything is a little bit political, even when it shouldn't. It was pretty cool this weekend seeing a video of, I believe, Halle's aunt and grandfather sharing a story of how the grandfather, saw his father picking cotton in the South as a young man, and today he's able to watch his granddaughter in theaters as the Little Mermaid. Talk about a turnaround story of life, of growth, and also just recognizing that we are not too far away from this moment that we had called slavery. It's within this generation, people who live in today at some point experienced some level of it or saw it. And again, that grandfather, Halle Bailey, can see one moment his father was picking cotton and now his granddaughter is in theaters as Little Mermaid. For those who are joining on Instagram, I'm actually live on YouTube. I decided I'm going to figure out this cadence of going live multiple places. And the reality of going live is a lot easier to take that and cut it later for repurposing than it is to just record a 90-second script, because you strive for perfection and not for getting it out. So, Disney, of course, needed this win, amidst the political drama that's taking place in Florida with Governor DeSantis and its poor financial performance this year, as noted by its stock. this movie, this win was a major one. Now, I still have to go and watch the movie. I thought about going this weekend, of course, it's release weekend, but as a 25-year-old single male, I wasn't the most comfortable going into a theater of Little Mermaid on opening weekend. I can only imagine the audience that would be in there by default. So, I'll get to that. I'll watch it. But in reality, even if this is the world's greatest movie, I think it's time for Hollywood, it's time for Disney to really introduce some new universes, some new movies, because I think we've done all the remakes that we should permit Hollywood to do at this point. So that is ideal. Let's go do remakes. But also in reality, we're in the midst of a writer's strike. So they might need to go back and just remake every movie from the 80s and 90s using the same exact script, unless they want to get this strike figured out and pay writers what they are worth and what they are due in this post-streaming world that we are in. For those who are joining on Instagram, hey y'all, just so y'all know, I am live on YouTube. As I've promised, I'm doing these business or economic explainers, and I figured it's best to just go live and have a conversation with y'all. You tell me how you're feeling, you tell me what's on your mind, what questions you have, and I'll answer them. And I'll just take the video that I'm doing live on YouTube and have it chopped up for, shorter bits on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok and wherever else we go. Now to the debt ceiling. While my goal isn't to always spend time on politics, political news, and drama, it is a fact that politics always runs in parallel with economic news, especially the U.S. economy. After months of political blame across the aisle on the debt ceiling, a tentative deal was reached between President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy on May 27. This deal will suspend the debt ceiling for 2 years and set spending caps for fiscal years 2024 and 2025, with provisions and concessions from both parties. That is ultimately how negotiation should work, and I'm glad that we have made it to this point. The debt ceiling was raised to $31.4 trillion in December 2021, and it reached that ceiling mid-January of this year. The Treasury Department has been using what Secretary Yellen has called extraordinary measures to avoid defaulting on payments. Now, what is the debt ceiling? Because I think in politics, there's this big question of is this a spending conversation or is this a back pay conversation? And when I break it down to everyday consumer, this is what the debt ceiling is about. It's not a budget on what the government will spend or won't spend in the future. Yes, there's a conversation in that, and they're going to negotiate the spending and budget for the future. But the debt ceiling is the equivalent of having to pay your credit card, make a car payment, and a home mortgage for the next month. And if you miss those payments as you're late, you've effectively defaulted on those obligations. So that's exactly where the U.S. government is they have a week, I think it's June 3rd or June 4th, that Secretary Yellen has announced that she has to have a deal in place to make these payments. So, this debt ceiling is one of those things that forces both sides of the aisle to actually negotiate, no matter how much they want to push their political agenda on each side, which quite frankly, we've lost any level of moderate politics since probably the Obama or before era. So pending the long-form alignment of the House and the Senate, this deal can become law before the middle of the first week of June, which was the hard deadline expressed by Secretary Yellen. So excited that there's a chance we may not hit default. Hey, Ambria, if you're watching, how you doing? It's my cousin. Love that girl out here killing the game. So aside from the default in itself, we should see interest rates and the stock market stabilize a bit more than it has been over the last few months. In the deal, we'll see a cap on federal spending for the next 2 years, keeping non-defense spending flat in 2024 and an increase of 1% in 2025, while defense spending would remain untouched. This is down significantly from President Biden's budget request initially, which asked for a 16% increase in non-defense spending and a 1.7% increase of defense spending in 2024. So ultimately, I think the Democrats had to give a lot of the request up to keep spending flat, which will have a lot of impacts. Where cost of living has increased, now the federal government can't spend more to match that increase, which ultimately means that its programs and services that rely on the federal government to fund them will be impacted. That's education, that's infrastructure, that's environmental protections, that's healthcare, so forth and so on. There's also a provision in the deal that have Republicans excited. They've pushed hard to expand work requirements for recipients of food stamps, raising the age limit of childless adults who must work or participate in training from age 49 to 54. And in reality, it makes sense. If someone is capable of working, they should be working in an effort to provide some level of their needs alongside the support that the government's providing. But that's a debate that both parties have consistently on what that requirement should be and who should be responsible for the work. The tax system is a give and take. You pay taxes in, and that will benefit you either today or at some point in the future, unless we lose Social Security, which, again, it's America, and as bad as we've been with managing money the last 5, 10, 15, 20, forever, we'll see if we have retirement to play with in the future. But speaking of, of course, economy, of course, this idea of default could lead to recession. Let's talk interest rates, because this week there is a big meeting with the FOMC. So since peaking at over 9% last year, the Federal Reserve has been fighting inflation by hiking interest rates in 2022. When the feds raise their rates, it increases the interest rates of the debts that you take, whether it be your mortgages, new fixed loans, or existing variable rate loans, credit cards, new car loans. It also crashes banks like Silicon Valley Bank or First Republic Bank because they have debts that they've issued to customers at low rates. They've also made investments in things such as bonds at low rates, but now they have to pay out more in interest rates to keep cash on hand. So the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC of the U.S. Federal Reserve is scheduled to meet again on June 13th through 14th. That's one of 8 meetings throughout this year. Many economists are predicting that coming out of this meeting, there will be a pause in rate hikes, which is extremely welcomed news. If there's a pause in rate hikes, it's a good time to invest those in fixed rate CDs, because if they pause the rates, that means there won't be any additional higher paying CDs to come out in the period of that hike. So it's a good time to go ahead and put money into CDs now. Now, I don't foresee a decrease in rates anytime soon. That's just not a reality from where we're at. We're still fighting inflation. Core inflation has remained high over 5% for several months. And this is one of the factors that the Fed looks at. Their target for core inflation is 2%. So we're at 5%. We've been there for a while. They want 2%. And there's also an additional factor that's unique, and that's unemployment. In reality, the Fed wants to see higher unemployment rates than 4%. And that's where we're at. They want to see 10%. They want to see 15%. And they also don't want to see wages increasing by 4%, because that means if people are employed, if they're getting raises, they can keep up with inflation, which justifies inflation, which keeps this machine going on and on and on. That's exactly why we go back to 2022, 2021, 2020. Of course, interest rates were lower. A lot of money was in the ecosystem. Everyone could afford to buy a bigger house, a more expensive house, and that increased the pricing of housing. And so as long as people can keep making money and they can keep getting raises, that does not help this conversation around interest rates. And so that's what the Fed is going to push for. But what's interesting is as the Fed is fighting inflation and they're increasing the interest rates, which increases the cost of servicing your debt, it has costlier mortgages, which means it's impacting the affordability of homes, which means the house that you bought for $500 might be worth $400 because the interest rate on that payment is now the equivalent of paying $2,000 versus $3,000 for that same sized house. That means lower spending power and reduced movement of cash. That is essentially the beginning of a recession. Recessions are closely correlated and impacted by interest rates. Higher interest rates equal lower economic activity. And as seemingly every company from Facebook to Microsoft is laying off employees, tens of thousands at a time. So it may already feel like we're in a recession because the companies are acting like it, right? But this is a debate that many economists are having. Are we in a recession currently, or is it still to come? But in reality, what I see this as, the companies are laying off to prepare for a potential recession, both in precaution, but both as a benefit to their immediate cash outlays, which is something that we should all be doing. We should all be paying down our high interest rates. So, of course, approaching recession, we should be paying down our high interest rates, reducing our expenses and our obligations. So let's maybe not get a new car. Let's maybe not renew a lease. Let's evaluate what we're spending money on and be sure that it's the right spaces to spend money at the right interest rates. We should be saving cash, in higher interest products, high yield savings accounts, CDs. And I wouldn't have a lot in the stock market unless you have a high risk profile or you have a nice percentage of investments in, of course, stock market, but also in some of those fixed income assets. So that's really what I had, planned today in conversation. We talked Little Mermaid. What else did we talk? Little Mermaid, debt ceiling. We talked recession. We talked interest rate hikes. That's what we're in right now. But for those who are Instagram, so you all know I am live on YouTube.